They dragged a black man out of a luxury bank by his arms while the marble lobby watched in silence, not because he shouted or resisted, but because he dared to exist there, calm, composed, and unwelcome. He had spoken no threats, made no scenes, offered only paperwork and patience, but that wasn't enough to stop the security guards from gripping his coat and hauling him through the doors like a trespasser. No one asked who he was. No one cared to. They only saw what they chose to see: skin, posture, clothes that didn't shout wealth loudly enough. They didn't know they were putting hands on someone far more important than anyone in that building could imagine. That moment wasn't just a mistake, it was the spark that would ignite a chain reaction inside a system built on silence. As his heels scraped across the polished floor, every rule they relied on to justify their actions began to unravel. This is not just a story about power or money. It's about what happens when truth refuses to stay buried and a man stripped of dignity chooses not to disappear. If that opening gripped you, hit the like button, subscribe for the full series, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what do you think this story is really about? Let's talk. It was just past 9 a.m. when Maurice Kincaid stepped through the brass-trimmed glass doors of Silver Ridge Bank, the flagship branch seated like a crown jewel at the heart of downtown's financial district. The lobby inside gleamed with a sterile kind of elegance: white marble floors buffed to a mirror finish, chrome fixtures polished daily, and soft classical music floating from invisible speakers. The air smelled faintly of citrus and lacquered wood. It was a place designed to impress, to intimidate, to draw clear lines between those who belonged and those who didn't. Maurice, by appearance alone, fell into the latter category. His trench coat, though neatly buttoned, bore the slight fuzz and sun-faded edge of a garment that had endured too many seasons. His shoes were old leather, functional and quiet, the kind made to survive long distances rather than impress strangers. His face was calm but unreadable, skin weathered and beard graying in patches along his jaw. He moved with a purposeful stillness, carrying a thick envelope tucked under one arm, his eyes sweeping once across the lobby, not in awe, but in observation. From the first moment he crossed the threshold, every movement of Maurice Kincaid was measured. Every breath controlled. He had been in places like this before. He knew the rules without needing them written down. Walk straight. Speak softly. Do not assume comfort. He entered the customer line and waited patiently behind a young couple dressed in polished workwear, their conversation light and oblivious to the man standing 3 feet behind them. A tall man in a double-breasted navy suit tapped rapidly on his phone nearby. A woman in heels clicked across the marble, nodding at the concierge. No one looked at Maurice. Not yet. But the front desk receptionist saw him. Her nameplate read Tasha Blevins, and she'd been trained to make judgment calls quickly. One glance at Maurice, his coat, his dark skin, the envelope, and her shoulders stiffened. She reached below the counter, pressed a call button, without breaking eye contact with the customer she was assisting, and then looked past Maurice like he wasn't even standing there. The signal was routine, subtle, efficient. Within 30 seconds, 2 security guards emerged from opposite corners of the lobby. They didn't rush. They didn't raise their voices. They simply converged, one from the elevator bank, one from the hallway near the executive offices. Maurice shifted his weight slightly as they approached. One of them, a broad man with a military jaw and gloved hands, came up beside him. "Sir," he said, voice flat, "can you step to the side with us?" Maurice looked at him with quiet eyes, but said nothing. Instead, he turned to the desk, gently laid the envelope on the marble, and offered a polite nod to Tasha. She didn't return it. The second guard, lighter in build, but more aggressive in posture, reached for the envelope. He didn't ask permission. He simply took it and opened it right there in the lobby. Inside was a request form, a standard document printed cleanly in black ink, requesting access to trust account statements and beneficiary transaction records. Nothing unusual, nothing illegal, just paperwork. The heavier guard, Rex, studied the page with a frown, then exchanged a look with the other man. "Come with us," he said again, this time not waiting for agreement. They didn't drag him, but the intention was clear. A firm grip on the arm, a pivot of the shoulders. They walked him past the line of onlookers, most of whom pretended to be busy with their phones. A few raised eyebrows. One woman whispered to her partner. A child in a stroller stared with wide, blinking eyes. Not a single person stepped in. Not one voice questioned what was happening. They brought Maurice to a side hallway used mostly for deliveries and equipment storage. Fluorescent lights flickered above, casting shadows across the beige linoleum floor. Rex pressed Maurice against the wall with mechanical ease and began patting him down, checking inside coat pockets and sliding fingers along the seams. The other guard held the envelope like it might contain a threat. Neither asked why he was there. Neither showed a shred of doubt in what they were doing. Morris's face never changed. No resistance. No protest. His eyes stayed on the cracked ceiling tile above him, watching the light tremble. The search turned up nothing. There was nothing to find. No weapons. No threats. Just a man and his paperwork. Rex finished, took a step back, and nodded. He's clean. The other guard didn't respond. He kept his eyes on Maurice, like waiting for something else to justify the interruption. After a beat, Darren Holt arrived. The branch manager. Trim. White. Tailored suit. He walked with a kind of casual confidence that came from knowing no one would ever stop him in a hallway and press him against a wall. He offered a smile that was meant to be disarming, but came off as smug. "Mr. Kincaid," he said, glancing at the form. "We take our security protocols seriously. I'm sure you understand." His tone didn't leave room for agreement or disagreement. He skimmed the page, scoffed faintly, and then passed it back with 2 fingers. "If you're looking for account information, you'll need to go through our main process. We don't process forms like this over the counter. There are channels." He turned as if the matter were closed. The guards released their grip. Maurice took the paper, smoothed the creases, folded it neatly back into its envelope. This time he bypassed the front counter and moved directly to the service desk near the western wing, where clients were often directed for more complex matters. He waited patiently, standing straight while other customers came and went, some glancing in his direction with vague curiosity, others ignoring him entirely. The receptionist, a young woman with dark hair pulled tight and eyes that flicked quickly between screens, glanced up once, and then kept typing. 10 minutes passed. 15. Maurice said nothing. He remained in place, folder in hand, posture unchanged. Finally, when the desk cleared, he stepped forward and spoke with quiet clarity. He explained that he had submitted a request the day before, that he had been removed from the premises during the process, and that he would like to continue the process properly. The receptionist didn't meet his eyes. She asked for his identification, which he provided without hesitation. She examined the license, flipped through the folder, then typed a few words into the system. Her brow creased. She asked for his social security number. He recited it from memory. She frowned and typed again. Then her lips thinned. "There's nothing here," she said, barely masking the skepticism in her tone. Maurice felt his stomach drop, but his face remained composed. He asked her to double-check. He told her the account was under a trust. He provided the full trust name. She checked again. Her eyes remained on the screen, but her voice grew colder. "Sir, there's no account matching that name. Are you sure you're at the correct institution?" The question wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed in professional etiquette. Maurice asked if he could speak with the account services officer directly. She replied that there was no officer available at this time. Then she offered to refer him to their community outreach representative, a woman who handled basic account setup, budgeting, education, and financial literacy programs. Maurice declined the offer, his voice still calm, still respectful. He asked again for someone in trust operations. That was when the security detail arrived. Not the same guards as yesterday. This time, it was a new pair. One older man with a shaved head and a flak vest. The other a broad-shouldered younger man with a heavy walk and a nervous smile. They didn't speak at first. They stood beside the desk while the receptionist whispered something inaudible. The older guard stepped forward. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step away from the desk." Maurice asked why. The guard didn't answer. He repeated the command. Maurice stayed where he was. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. He simply asked if he could speak to someone about his account. The guard's response was not verbal. He reached out and placed a firm hand on Maurice's shoulder, fingers pressing down like a vice. "We're not doing this today," he said. The pressure increased. The folder slipped slightly from Maurice's grasp, but he caught it before it fell. The younger guard moved to his other side. Maurice turned toward them, not in resistance, but in a quiet, forced compliance. He allowed himself to be escorted, again through the lobby, past silent watchers, past whispers that buzzed just under the music floating from the ceiling. But this time, they didn't take him to the hallway. This time, they brought him to the front entrance and opened the doors wide. Cold air rushed in. They stepped out with him, then turned him toward the street. As he tried to speak, the younger guard gently pushed his elbow. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," he muttered. At the edge of the sidewalk, Maurice turned to face them. "I only want to access my own account," he said. The older guard stepped forward and held up a hand. "That's not our concern. Take it up with corporate." Maurice looked past him at the glass doors. Inside, the receptionist was already turned back toward her screen, typing as if nothing had happened. Maurice lowered his eyes and stepped away from the bank's threshold. He walked slowly toward the bus stop down the block, folder clutched tightly in his hand. The cars on the street roared past him. No one looked. No one cared. When he reached the corner, he turned down a side street and leaned against the stone wall of a dry cleaner. There, out of sight, he opened the folder and examined the documents again. Everything was in order. His name, the trust name, the routing numbers, the notarized signatures. Nothing had changed. The problem wasn't the paperwork. The problem was him. That afternoon, he returned to the apartment where he had been staying, a small furnished unit with creaky floorboards and chipped countertops. He sat in the kitchen beneath a flickering light and stared at the envelope. He thought of calling someone, but who? Every point of contact at the bank had been erased, redirected, or denied. He thought of filing a complaint. But how do you file a complaint against silence? Against erasure? Against a system that pretends you were never there? He ate nothing that night. Maurice's footsteps were slow but steady, his breath visible in clouds. In one hand, he carried a leather folder, thicker now, containing not only the account request, but documentation verifying ownership stakes, a notarized declaration of identity, and internal communication records from the bank's public investor relations team, all of which had once passed through their own system. He arrived at the Silver Ridge Bank before it opened, taking a seat on the granite ledge of the planters near the main entrance. He didn't look around. He didn't fidget. He simply sat and waited. At 8:58, employees began to trickle in through the side staff entrance. Young analysts, uniformed security, customer service reps in navy blazers. Most glanced at him, but quickly looked away. When the main doors opened at 9 o'clock, Maurice was the first to walk inside. The scent of citrus oil and marble polish greeted him again, along with the soft swell of strings playing overhead. He moved with confidence, not aggression, passing the front desk and heading directly for the private services wing. This time, he didn't stop at reception. He walked straight to the frosted glass door labeled Account Administration and knocked once before entering. Inside, two employees looked up from behind their computers, startled. One, a man with thinning hair and rounded glasses, stood quickly. "You can't be in here," he said, already stepping forward. Maurice lifted the folder and held it at his chest. "I need a moment of someone's time. I've been denied access to my own records. I have the documents here. I'd appreciate the courtesy of a formal review." His voice was calm, composed, but not soft. It carried the weight of someone who had run out of excuses to accept silence. The man didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the younger woman beside him, who sat frozen, one hand hovering over her mouse. After a pause, the man gestured for Maurice to wait in the hallway. "I'll get someone." Maurice nodded and stepped back, allowing the door to close slowly behind him. He stood in the hallway for nearly 20 minutes. Customers passed him. Employees avoided his gaze. Every few minutes, he shifted his weight, but his eyes never left the door. When it finally opened again, it was not the man who returned. It was a different figure, Trenton Mears, a mid-level operations officer with a reputation for decisiveness and a clipped, no-nonsense tone. Mears wore a dark gray suit with narrow lapels and held a digital tablet in one hand. He didn't smile. "Sir, I'm told there's been a misunderstanding. I can clarify the situation, but I need you to step into the client lounge." Maurice followed him into a glass-walled room with 2 leather chairs and a small coffee table. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Mears sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and tapped a few things on his tablet. "Unfortunately, we're still not locating any active records in your name. I've verified across all tiers: retail, private, trust, corporate. Nothing appears. Can you tell me what institution you believe the account was created under?" Maurice opened the folder and produced a sheet with the original account registration, a document bearing the bank's official letterhead, dated 7 years earlier, and signed by a senior trust officer who had since retired. Mears took it and frowned. "This is unusual. These signatures check out, but I don't see a digital trail." Maurice said nothing. He pulled out another sheet, this one showing quarterly earnings distributions tied to that account number, routed through shell entities linked directly to the bank's investment division. Mears studied it longer. Then his expression hardened. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Maurice replied evenly, "It's mine." Mears tapped his tablet again, then stood. "I'll be right back." He left the room. The door closed. Maurice waited. 30 minutes passed. Then 40. The music outside continued to play, a soothing orchestral track that made the passage of time feel longer. When the door opened again, it was not Mears who returned. It was Darren Holt. This time, the branch manager did not wear a welcoming smile. His lips were pressed in a line. His eyes were guarded. "Mr. Kincaid," he said, his tone clipped, "we've reviewed your documents. Unfortunately, we cannot authenticate them against our current system. There may have been an error or miscommunication at some point, but as of now, there is no evidence of a valid account under your name. We can provide you with contact information for our regulatory liaison team if you wish to pursue this further." Maurice stood slowly. "You won't acknowledge the documents in your own handwriting. You won't acknowledge the deposits. You won't acknowledge the routing logs or internal confirmations." Holt didn't blink. "I'm sorry," he said. Maurice nodded once. He turned and exited the lounge. But as he stepped into the main lobby, something new awaited him. 2 guards stood at the door, not casually positioned, but stationed. When Maurice neared, one of them held out a hand. "Sir, we've been asked to formally advise you not to return to this branch. Any further visits without a scheduled appointment may result in a trespass report." Maurice paused. He stared at the man, then looked past him at the marble floor, the polished counters, the steel-framed windows. He looked at the receptionist who pretended not to hear, at the cameras that never missed a frame. He stepped forward until he was face to face with the guard. "Noted," he said. Then he left. Outside, the sun had risen higher, but the cold had not relented. He walked 2 blocks before ducking into a vacant alley behind a shuttered bistro. There, under the shadow of old fire escapes, he leaned against the wall and breathed. At 6 a.m., Maurice dressed again, this time wearing a charcoal coat with a repaired seam along the left shoulder and freshly shined black shoes. He walked 2 miles to the west side of the financial district, bypassing the flagship Silver Ridge branch entirely, and approached a smaller regional office nestled between a law firm and a dry cleaner. The building didn't carry the same gleaming elegance. Its front windows were slightly dusty, its floor tiles beige and unpolished, and its automatic doors creaked faintly when they opened. Still, it bore the same logo. It served the same corporation. This time, Maurice waited until the bank was fully open, until employees were seated, settled, and the first wave of customers had begun to thin. Then he stepped forward to the front desk, presented his folder with the usual calm, and asked to speak with a trust account liaison. The receptionist, a man in his early 20s with earbuds still hanging from one ear, asked for his ID, which Maurice provided. He keyed in the name, waited, then blinked. "I'm not finding anything in the system," he said. Maurice remained composed. "Please check under the trust title," he said, and slid a second sheet forward, one bearing the registered entity name. The receptionist typed again, more slowly, then frowned. He asked Maurice to wait and disappeared through a frosted glass door behind the counter. 5 minutes passed. 10. Maurice stood near the side wall, away from the main lobby, keeping his posture still, folder held in front of him like a passport through customs. A few customers glanced his way. An older woman with red-framed glasses looked once, then twice, then narrowed her eyes as though trying to place him. Maurice lowered his gaze. When the receptionist returned, he was not alone. A woman in a gray blazer followed him, holding a tablet, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, extending a hand that never fully closed around his. "I understand you're trying to locate an account. May I ask who referred you to this branch?" Maurice explained that he had visited the main office and received no assistance, that his records had not appeared there, and he was following up here. She nodded slowly, but the lines around her mouth tightened. "Our systems are integrated. If they couldn't locate it, we likely won't have better luck. But I'm happy to check one more time." She took the documents from his hand and disappeared behind the door. While he waited, Maurice stepped aside to sit on a small bench in the corner of the lobby. A flat-screen TV mounted overhead displayed muted financial news, stock tickers running endlessly beneath the anchor's frozen smile. The bank's marketing slogan, strength, trust, service, ran across the screen every few minutes, a cruel joke in motion. 20 minutes passed. The woman returned, this time with a man in a dark vest and rolled-up sleeves. He looked more serious, more deliberate. "Mr. Kincaid, I'm Robert Marsh," he said. "I'm one of the operations managers here. May I ask you to come with me to our meeting room for a moment?" Maurice followed without a word. The meeting room was small, lit with a single overhead bulb and walls of synthetic wood paneling. Marsh closed the door, opened a laptop, and laid out Morris's documents across the table. "I reviewed these," he said. "They're very thorough. I also reached out to our internal audit desk. Here's the issue. The trust entity does exist in our registry. However, its primary contact and verification data are redacted. I'm unable to confirm your role without access credentials tied to the master authorization log, which we don't have on site." Maurice leaned forward slightly. "Who does?" Marsh hesitated. "That would be processed through corporate compliance. However, the name you're presenting as the principal isn't linked to the current active file. It appears that during a restructuring event 2 years ago, certain credentials were reset. It's possible your name was replaced during that period." Maurice closed his eyes for a moment, nodded. "Replaced without my consent?" Marsh didn't answer. Instead, he said, "I'm not in a position to make that determination, but I would advise you to file a verification dispute through our legal correspondence unit. They can initiate a review." "How long?" Maurice asked. Marsh hesitated again. "Could be weeks. Could be months." That was the moment Maurice realized it wasn't just the front-facing employees or the policies that had conspired against him. The rot was in the system, deep, structural, designed not to deny, but to delay until the claimant gave up. He left the meeting room with the folder tucked under his arm once more, walked past the same red-glassed woman still filling out her deposit slip, and stepped out into the gray light of late morning. The cold air struck his face harder this time, not just because of the weather, but because of the weight on his chest. They had found the record. They had acknowledged the trust. But they had also found a way to separate him from it, to bury him beneath layers of procedure that made his access vanish, while the institution continued to profit off the very account he created. By the time Maurice returned to his apartment, he had stopped seeing the documents as tools. They were now evidence. Not of his wealth, not of his rights, but of his erasure. He sat at the kitchen table, lined them up again, and began rewriting his own history, name by name, number by number, date by date, cataloging everything they denied, preparing for the next round not as a petitioner, but as a witness in a case that only he could prove. That night, he ate a cold meal, drank tap water from a cracked mug, and reviewed the list of past bank employees he once interacted with, names long removed from company directories, people who had moved on or disappeared into promotions and early retirements. Only one had replied. Her email was brief and hesitant, confirming that she had indeed processed documents under the trust's name several years prior, and that Morris's name had appeared on beneficiary records during her tenure. But she now worked in another sector and couldn't say what changes occurred after her departure. She signed her name at the bottom, but did not include her number. Maurice had printed the email and filed it behind a divider labeled correspondence. It was thin, but it was something. He stared at the folder now, laying open before him like a broken compass. He had facts. He had evidence. But he still had no key. The bank had buried the master credential files during a system restructuring, and without access to those logs, his status would remain disputed. Every day that passed was a silent rejection, a tightening loop. His identity remained tied to an account he could not reach, profits he could not touch, and a legacy he could no longer prove without permission from the very people trying to erase him. That morning, he called the main branch again, requesting a meeting with compliance. The receptionist, polite but dismissive, informed him that all requests had to be routed through the bank's digital portal. Maurice reminded her that he had submitted forms 3 times without acknowledgement. She repeated the instruction without apology. The call ended in silence. He stared at the phone long after it disconnected. Something inside him cracked, not loudly, not violently, but with a quiet sting of bone under pressure. He needed to be seen, not just by systems or letters or screens, but by people, living, breathing people who couldn't ignore him once he stood before them. He dressed in silence, fixed his collar, tightened his belt, and placed the folder in a plain black messenger bag. He walked to the bank again, not the flagship branch this time, nor the West Side office, but the uptown location where the regional compliance officer kept an auxiliary suite. The building was modern, tall, and glass-faced, less elegant than the downtown location, but more self-assured, like it didn't need to try so hard to prove its status. Maurice entered through the revolving doors and approached the front desk with measured resolve. The woman behind the desk asked his name. He gave it. She checked the list. His name wasn't there. He asked to speak with the officer directly. She called upstairs, waited, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir, but without an appointment." He held up a hand gently. "Please just let them know I'm here. I'm not asking for much. Just acknowledgement." She hesitated, then relented. She dialed again, whispered into the receiver, and nodded once. "Someone will be down shortly." Maurice thanked her and stepped aside. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. When the elevator finally chimed, it was not the compliance officer who stepped out. It was a man in a slate suit and narrow tie, a clipped badge on his lapel, reading client operations. He approached with cautious confidence. "Mr. Kincaid," he said, "I understand you're seeking account verification. I've been asked to inform you that all inquiries must go through our online resolution portal. You've already been informed of this process." Maurice looked him in the eye. "And I've followed it. I've submitted everything. I've waited weeks." No reply. The man offered a practiced nod. "Then I suggest patience. We'll contact you once a determination has been made." Maurice took a slow breath. "While I wait, the institution continues to profit from an account tied to my name, with no consent and no visibility. Do you understand how that looks?" The man's expression didn't change. "Mr. Kincaid, we don't make decisions based on feelings. We follow process. Now if there's nothing further," Maurice interrupted, his voice soft but sharp. "You're not listening. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for what's mine." The man's posture stiffened. "Sir, if you cannot remain civil, I'll have to ask you to leave." Maurice stepped back. The room spun, not from anger, but from clarity. They weren't ignoring him out of oversight. They were doing it deliberately. The man turned, walked back toward the elevator, and vanished behind closing steel doors. Maurice left the building in silence. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling loose leaves along the sidewalk. He didn't go home. Instead, he walked aimlessly, past office towers and bus stops, past people in coats and scarves who didn't see him, past reflective windows where his own face seemed unfamiliar. He ended up in front of the Silver Ridge flagship branch without meaning to. He stared at the doors for a long time, the memory of the guard's warning echoing in his ears. Do not return. Do not disturb. Do not exist. He turned away. That night, he sat in the apartment and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in months. As the hours passed and the morning brightened into cold, indifferent light, Maurice made the decision to return. Not to a side branch, not to an alternate office, but to the main one, the place where he had first been stripped of any acknowledgement, where they had handled him like a problem instead of a man. He wasn't sure what compelled him now. Perhaps it was the desire to confront it again, not to win, but to show himself that he could stand inside that place and not break. Or perhaps he had grown tired of waiting for someone else to do what only he could. Either way, he boarded a downtown bus, took the long ride in silence, and stepped onto the same steps he had walked weeks ago with the same folder, the same coat, and the same need. The building loomed above him, immaculate as ever, its glass and stone exterior reflecting the clouds. Inside, everything looked the same. The floors gleamed. The music played softly. The staff smiled at others and avoided his gaze. Maurice stepped through the doors and headed straight for the reception counter, placing his documents on the marble with steady hands. He requested to speak to a senior officer in trust operations. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fumble his words, but he spoke with a quiet finality that made the receptionist hesitate. She didn't respond immediately. She picked up the phone, murmured something, and replaced the receiver. Then she offered him a brittle smile and asked him to step aside. Maurice moved to the side as instructed, his eyes never leaving the far hallway where suits moved like shadows. Minutes passed, then more. He stood still, folder clutched in front of him like armor, refusing to be the first to back away. Then he saw them, 2 security guards, different from the last, stepping through the glass doors that separated the public lobby from the executive corridor. They walked in tandem, both taller than him, both with a kind of practiced blankness in their eyes that meant they'd already decided who he was. The taller of the 2 gestured. Maurice didn't move. You've been instructed not to return to this branch, the guard said, his voice low and hard. Maurice nodded. I'm aware. I'm asking to speak to someone who can actually review these documents. I've submitted them through every proper channel. No one's responded. The guard took a step closer. That's not our concern. You need to leave the premises now. Maurice stayed rooted. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. But he didn't move. The second guard placed a hand on his shoulder, less firm than before, as if testing his reaction. Maurice looked at him and then lowered his voice. This account exists. The trust is real. I am not leaving until someone acknowledges what this bank has done. The taller guard signaled. That was all it took. Maurice didn't see it coming fast enough. The second guard grabbed his arm. The first stepped behind him, pinning his other side. The movement wasn't violent, but it was decisive. They twisted his shoulders, forcing him to turn, and began walking him toward the front doors. Each step was slow and excruciating. He did not fight, but neither did he comply like someone ashamed. He walked with them, head high, back straight, the folder still clutched in his hands. A few people watched. A woman in heels lowered her coffee cup. A man in a tailored suit turned his head slightly, then looked away. No one said a word. No one reached out. The guards walked Maurice through the wide glass doors onto the sidewalk and then stopped. They released him with practiced coordination, like dropping off a delivery. One turned and stepped back inside. The other lingered. This is your last warning, he said, voice stripped of pretense. Do not come back. Maurice didn't respond. He didn't even nod. He stood there, the wind twisting at the hem of his coat, eyes fixed on the lobby, beyond the glass. For a brief second, he saw himself reflected back. shoulders stiff, mouth set in a straight line, folder pressed tight against his chest. He didn't recognize the man. This version of himself had been shaped by days of rejection, by the grinding process of being dismissed with civility, by the kind of humiliation that didn't bruise skin, but bruised everything beneath it. That version looked older, harder, lonelier. He turned and walked, not away from the bank, but around the corner, into the alley where delivery vans parked and where discarded paper cups rolled along the pavement. There, out of sight, he stopped, opened his folder, and flipped through the documents one more time. Every name, every date, every signature was exactly as it had always been. Nothing in the folder had changed. The only thing that had changed was the system's willingness to pretend it no longer mattered. He knelt slowly beside the wall and sat on the cold pavement, folder open in his lap, hands shaking not from fear or cold, but from exhaustion. He thought about everything he had endured since this started. The first time they ignored his name, the moment they said there was nothing on file, the time they said he had no right to what he had created. They had erased him in pieces. Not with fire, not with theft, but with rules. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. He could still feel the pressure of their hands on his arms, the way they gripped just tight enough to control, but not to bruise. The precision of it all was what lingered. The system had not bent even slightly under the truth he had placed at its feet. For a long time, he stared into nothing, and then, with the slow motion of a man stepping into deeper water, he reached for the bottom of the folder. Hidden beneath the stack of notarized forms and trust documents was a single plastic card embossed with a name different from the one on his driver's license. It bore a corporate seal, a signature from a long-retired chairman, and an access level that, once upon a time, had permitted him entry to the innermost workings of the institution that now refused to say his name. Maurice turned the card over slowly. He hadn't touched it in years. He had deliberately stepped away from that life, from that power, from that level of visibility. It had been part of his plan, to build quietly, to own quietly, to influence from behind the curtain. But the world had changed. Or perhaps it had not changed at all. It had simply revealed itself again, brutal and unchanged. With trembling fingers, he placed the card in his wallet, stood, and moved to his bedroom closet. From the back corner, he retrieved a dust-covered box and opened it carefully. Inside were cufflinks, a silver pen, a fountain ink ledger, and a navy blue folder embossed with the name of a holding company few outside of high finance would recognize. He pulled the folder out, opened it, and reviewed the contents: ownership certificates, asset control documents, and a board list. His name was listed twice, once as a founding officer, once as the final signer on a hidden transfer of control. The institution that had humiliated him, the system that had cast him out without blinking, was one of a dozen entities tied to this structure. And while his name did not appear on the surface of any of them, the web of control beneath the surface remained real. It had been his design. He had disappeared himself by choice, but now that choice had become a weapon turned against him. At noon, he dressed in a clean white shirt, a charcoal suit he hadn't worn in years, and the dark leather shoes he had once reserved for boardrooms. He stood in the mirror and adjusted his collar, tightening the knot of his tie until it sat snug at the base of his throat. He looked like someone else, like someone the world listened to. The same man, but different skin. He left the apartment with his folder in hand, his steps measured, his pace steady. He did not head to the bank this time. Instead, he went to the tower downtown where the holding company maintained its silent offices, tucked behind a firm name that served only as a shell. He took the elevator to the top floor and entered the reception area. The woman behind the desk looked up, her smile uncertain. Maurice handed her his identification and the corporate card. Her eyes widened slightly. She picked up the phone, murmured, and then stood to open the glass door. Within minutes, he was seated in a private conference room across from a man in a slate suit and thick glasses, the firm's internal counsel. Maurice opened the folder and laid out the documents. He did not speak of what had happened at the bank. He did not vent or accuse. He simply explained the breakdown in protocol, the obfuscation of his role, the unauthorized suppression of access. He showed the asset logs, the control transfers, the correspondence. When he finished, the attorney said nothing. He reviewed the pages, one by one, his mouth tightening, his eyes narrowing. Finally, he leaned back and nodded once. "I see," he said. "I'll initiate a record audit immediately." Maurice said, "You'll notify the board?" The man nodded again. "Today." Maurice stood. "Make sure they understand what's at stake." He left without shaking hands. The conversation had been clinical, surgical, not personal, but it had cut deeper than anything the guards at the bank had done. That afternoon, Maurice returned to his apartment and waited. He didn't pace. He didn't drink. He sat with the stillness of a man who had been broken and rebuilt, not with fire, but with patience. By evening, his phone rang. A number he recognized. The chairman, the real one. The voice on the other end greeted him cautiously. Not cold, not warm, but curious. The man had heard. He wanted to understand what had gone wrong. Maurice spoke carefully, laying out every moment, not with anger, but with surgical clarity. The voice on the other end did not interrupt. When Maurice finished, there was a long silence. Then the man said, "You'll be contacted within the hour." The call ended. Maurice stared at the phone in his hand, then set it down and returned to the table. 10 minutes later, his inbox chimed. A formal letter from Silver Ridge's executive division. But he was not the same man who had walked through the doors of Silver Ridge Bank 3 weeks ago, holding a folder like a plea. That man had worn his silence like armor, had believed that reason and procedure could protect him. This man had shed that skin. Now he prepared not to ask, not to prove, but to speak. By mid-morning, Maurice was dressed in his charcoal suit once more, the same understated attire that had once served him in boardrooms filled with polished men and rehearsed nods. His messenger bag was now neatly packed with nothing but 3 documents: the notarized trust structure, the board certification confirming his retained voting authority, and the compliance officer's formal apology. As he walked toward the administrative headquarters of Silver Ridge's parent firm, he passed the flagship bank branch without glancing inside. The building that had once humiliated him now stood like a relic of denial, silent and polished, unaware of the shift already working through its foundations. The headquarters stood 15 stories tall, understated in its design, with security stationed not for show, but for quiet enforcement. Maurice walked through the glass entrance without hesitation, showed his credentials, and was guided without question to the executive suite on the 12th floor. The hallways here smelled different, less of citrus polish, and more of aged paper and preserved authority. He was met at the elevator by a woman in a dark blue jacket with a clipboard and a practiced smile. She extended her hand and said his name with careful precision, as though testing it in her mouth. He nodded once and followed her down the corridor into a waiting room paneled in oak. He was told the board would be ready shortly. He waited in silence, seated in a chair across from a painting of a harbor, his back straight, his hands folded over his documents. When the door finally opened, he was ushered into a conference room with tall windows and a long table that could seat 20. Only 5 people were present: the chairman, the general counsel, the chief compliance officer, and 2 board members whose names Maurice remembered from previous reports. They rose as he entered, not with deference, but with a measured acknowledgement given to a man who had reminded them of something they'd forgotten. The chairman gestured to the seat at the head of the table, not an invitation, but recognition. Maurice sat, placed the documents before him, and met their eyes without flinching. What followed was not an argument. It was not a confrontation. It was a statement. Maurice laid out every instance of procedural failure, every barrier placed between him and his rights, every moment of indignity carried out under the shield of policy. He spoke without raising his voice, without breaking his rhythm, each word delivered like a ledger entry: fact, date, name, consequence. The men at the table did not interrupt. Some looked away. Others took notes. The compliance officer's face tightened with each point, his pen scratching across the paper like an apology he wasn't allowed to say aloud. When Maurice finished, he did not ask for anything. He stood, collected his folder, and looked directly at the chairman. "You already know what needs to be done," he said and walked out. He did not wait for discussion. He did not offer a path forward. He had brought them the truth. What they did with it was now their burden. Back at his apartment, Maurice sat by the window as light shifted across the skyline. The phone rang twice that afternoon. The first was from the board secretary, requesting a follow-up meeting with the bank's executive team. The second was from an old associate in institutional finance, someone who had heard about the morning's meeting and wanted to know what was coming next. Maurice answered neither with certainty. He simply said, "Let's wait and see." The following day, Silver Ridge Bank held a closed meeting at the downtown branch. The executive team, regional compliance leads, and a representative from the board attended. Maurice was not invited. He didn't need to be. His presence was already there. In every line of the report circulated to the attendees, in every sentence of the audit summary that named his experience as a failure of protocol and ethics. What those inside the bank had once dismissed as a customer inconvenience had been reframed as a structural breach, a legal exposure, a reputational threat. His silence had once made him invisible. Now his name, though still spoken in boardrooms with caution, had become synonymous with accountability. And outside, in the real world, no one yet knew. No press release was issued. No public apology made the headlines. But things were already shifting. Within 48 hours, Maurice received a formal letter from the bank's president, offering not only reinstatement of full access, but also a retroactive correction of the trust documentation, an internal review of personnel involved, and an invitation to participate in a new oversight initiative aimed at preventing similar failures. The letter was signed in ink. It used his full name. It closed with a single sentence that, though likely written by a legal team, carried more weight than the countless apologies that had come before it. "Your voice has exposed a fault in our foundation." Maurice read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same folder that had once felt like a burden. Now it felt like something else entirely. A record, yes, but also a key. That evening he sat by the window again, the city aglow with its quiet, blind movements, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment not of relief, but recognition. He had not won, not yet, but he had revealed himself, not through force, not through spectacle, but through relentless truth spoken in a world trained to look away. It began with internal memos, first circulated quietly, marked as confidential, but quickly leaking into side conversations and after-hours texts. An internal audit had been launched, not just for Morris's case, but for all dormant trust accounts tied to outdated ownership credentials. The number of irregularities reported in the first 48 hours was enough to push the board to schedule emergency sessions. Suddenly, legal and compliance departments were in constant motion, combing through years of filings and access logs, reconstructing records that had never been meant to be erased. Maurice wasn't in the room for those meetings, but his presence was everywhere. His case had become the example, the case study, the undeniable precedent. And with it came consequences. Darren Holt, the branch manager, who had first dismissed Maurice with a cold professional smile, received a request to appear before the internal review committee. He arrived in a press suit, still clinging to the polished demeanor that had served him for years, but beneath the surface, he could already sense the shift. The committee did not meet him with the usual warmth or respect. They asked about his decisions, about why no one had reviewed Morris's documents, why security had been deployed without verifying the legitimacy of the account request, and why multiple attempts to escalate were never formally recorded. Holt gave the standard responses: protocol, procedure, insufficient verification. But the answers rang hollow, especially when confronted with emails he had failed to forward and reports he had chosen not to file. At the same time, Rex Barrett, the senior security officer who had forcibly removed Maurice from the building on 2 occasions, was placed on unpaid suspension pending review. The investigation into his conduct revealed not only the mishandling of Morris's situation, but a troubling pattern of excessive force complaints, all of which had previously been buried under vague HR memos and administrative rerouting. His file, once protected by layers of internal shielding, now sat open on the compliance director's desk, and the weight of it was heavy. Meanwhile, the woman who had initially denied Maurice at the teller counter, Tasha Blevins, received a formal citation for failure to escalate. While her offense seemed minor compared to the others, it symbolized a larger issue. How many employees had been trained to look away, to dehumanize, to assume threat where none existed? Her citation was followed by a mandatory re-education program rolled out across the region. Sessions on implicit bias, structural discrimination, and procedural transparency. For many, it was the first time they had been asked to consider how decisions rooted in assumption could destroy lives. But the reckoning reached higher still. The regional compliance officer, who had ignored 3 formal submissions from Maurice without review, was forced to resign after the oversight was linked to other unresolved cases. His departure was swift, quiet, unceremonious. The official announcement cited personal reasons, but everyone in the executive corridor knew better. His name had appeared in the summary report circulated among board members, underlined in red beside the phrase systemic failure. And yet, none of these consequences were the result of Maurice pressing charges or filing lawsuits. He had done none of those things. He hadn't demanded punishment or revenge. His presence alone, truthful, documented, irrefutable, had done what threats and noise could not. He had become a mirror. And when the system looked into it, it was forced to confront what it had become. The media never got the full story. The board ensured that. They released a vague statement about reviewing internal procedures to uphold the highest standards of trust and equity. But Maurice's name was never mentioned. That, too, had been his choice. He didn't need headlines. He needed change. And that change, quiet as it was, began to ripple through places no one could ignore. A new internal policy was drafted within weeks, requiring third-party review of all escalated trust disputes. An independent ombudsman role was created to track client complaints that did not resolve within 10 business days. Maurice's case became part of the required reading for all new hires in the legal and compliance departments. In one meeting, behind closed doors, a junior board member asked if it might be wise to extend a public gesture to Maurice, some form of recognition, a plaque, a testimonial. The chairman said no, not out of disrespect, but out of understanding. Maurice had not asked for celebration. He had asked to be seen, and now finally he was. The transformation was not immediate, not dramatic, but it was real. Customers began receiving quicker responses to document disputes. Security personnel underwent de-escalation training. Senior managers were briefed weekly on complaint trends and outliers. And slowly, the institution began to shift, not from good intention, but from necessity. Because Maurice had exposed the cost of indifference, and that cost had now become too visible to ignore. Maurice, for his part, did not watch these changes unfold with triumph or satisfaction. He remained quiet, careful, almost invisible again, but this time by choice. He attended the meetings he needed to, approved the documents that required his signature, and spoke only when necessary. He had become not a loud force, but a guiding one, a presence that reminded those around him of what happens when silence is mistaken for weakness. One afternoon, he returned to the branch, not for business, but to observe. The staff greeted him differently now, not out of fear, but out of respect. They saw him not as a stranger, but as a figure whose dignity had reshaped their world. Even the younger guard at the door, new and unfamiliar, stood a little straighter when Maurice passed. Inside, the atmosphere was different, subtle, but unmistakable. People moved with more care. Interactions carried less assumption. Protocols were followed, but not weaponized. 3 months after the last internal memo, the one that concluded the audit and permanently revised the protocols that had once silenced him, Maurice Kincaid walked the long corridor of the new Financial Ethics Training Center, housed inside the very skyscraper that once shielded the worst of the old regime. The walls were lined with panels of frosted glass etched with phrases too carefully chosen by marketing teams, quotes about integrity and trust, words that in another life would have made him feel the kind of bitter irony that carves a man hollow. But not today. Today, the corridor was quiet, and the light filtering through the ceiling was clean, not clinical. He wore no suit, no tie, He dressed simply, unassumingly, in dark slacks and a gray button shirt with sleeves rolled once at the wrist. The leather bag he once carried like armor had been replaced with a worn portfolio folder, its corners softened by repetition, its contents now a part of institutional memory. At the end of a corridor, a small group waited. They stood by a set of double doors that opened into a mid-sized auditorium. Not grand, not cold, just formal enough for what this gathering was meant to be. This wasn't a celebration, not a ceremony. It was an orientation, a pilot class for new hires brought in under the revised framework, the one created in the shadow of his case. He was not there to be honored. He was there to speak for the first and last time about what had happened, not just to him, but through him. When he entered the room, heads turned. Most of the faces were young, attentive, wearing expressions somewhere between caution and curiosity. They had read the internal case study, seen the anonymized details, heard the story retold in memos and slide decks, but they had never heard it from the man himself. Maurice took the podium without announcement. There was no PowerPoint behind him, no title card. Just a man and a room and a silence thick enough to carry meaning. He began not with a description of events, but with a question. He asked them what it meant to erase someone without malice. He asked them how a system could maintain the illusion of fairness while grinding the humanity out of the people it claimed to serve. He asked how many decisions they would make in their careers that were shaped not by intention, but by inertia. He described the day he first walked into Silver Ridge Bank with nothing but facts, and was met not with questions or concern, but with a cold precision of exclusion. He told them about the hours he spent waiting, the way he was handled like a threat, the moments of silence, so sharp they became louder than any insult. But he also told them about the folder, about the records, about the patience it took to not lose himself in anger. He did not speak of vengeance. He spoke of truth, of resilience, of what it cost a man to carry his dignity through corridors designed to reject it. Then he paused. The room remained still. And in that stillness, he said the one thing none of them had expected. He forgave them, not because they had earned it, but because he had decided long ago that his identity would not be shaped by their failures. He forgave the bank, the guards, the tellers, the managers. He forgave the machine that had tried to erase him, because he had realized something deeper, that if he allowed their blindness to shape his soul, then they had succeeded in more than erasure. They had succeeded in defining him, and he refused to be defined by cowardice. He ended his talk not with advice, but with a challenge. He told them that justice was not a policy. It was a daily act, a choice, a discipline, something that must be defended when no one is watching, especially when it is inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unprofitable. He said that if they wanted to build institutions that endured, they had to begin by protecting the most invisible people in the room. Because systems do not collapse all at once. They corrode from within, quietly, when indifference becomes routine. When he stepped down from the podium, no one clapped. Not because they weren't moved, but because the air had become too thick with reckoning. They sat in stillness, absorbing the quiet weight of his truth. Maurice walked out of the room without waiting for response. He didn't need it. He had said what he came to say. Outside, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the plaza where bankers, assistants, and janitors moved past each other without friction. He stood there for a while, not searching for meaning, just existing inside a moment he had earned. The world around him looked unchanged, but he knew what had shifted. Not because the system was fixed, it wasn't. Not because the bank had been transformed, it hadn't. But because one truth had been forced into light, and once seen, it could not be unseen. In the weeks that followed, several of the employees who had once dismissed him reached out quietly. Some by letter, some by word of mouth through intermediaries. Darren Holt sent an envelope containing a handwritten apology, folded around a resignation letter. He said he had taken a job at a nonprofit not to make amends, but to learn. Rex Barrett, after being let go, was reported to have entered a training program for restorative justice, focusing on de-escalation methods and racial awareness. He never contacted Maurice directly. He didn't need to. Maurice heard enough to know the change was real. Not dramatic, not performative, but real. Tasha Blevins, the teller who once ignored him, was now working in the client advocacy team, quietly helping people who reminded her of someone she once chose not to see. One day, Maurice passed her in the lobby. Their eyes met. No words, but recognition. Sometimes, change doesn't come in declarations. Sometimes it comes in a glance that holds just a second longer. Maurice didn't return to the bank after that. He didn't need to. His name had been written into their history, not with statues or speeches, but with change. He lived simply, quietly. Some days, he volunteered with a legal aid group. Other days, he wrote letters for people fighting battles like the one he had already won. He never chased credit. He never raised his voice. He simply made sure that no one else would be as easily erased. The final time anyone from Silver Ridge saw him, he was walking past the building just before dusk, hands in his pockets, eyes focused on the horizon. A man who had once stood silent while guards stripped him of dignity now moved with the confidence of someone who had reclaimed everything they tried to take. Not just access, not just position, but his right to be seen and the power to make others visible in turn. And that was the end of the story, not because it stopped, but because the man at its center had become what the system feared most. Not loud, not angry, not broken, but undeniable. The end. If you've made it this far, thanks for being part of the journey. If this story moved you, made you think, or pulled you into its world, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and lets us keep bringing stories like this to life. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the plot so far? Which part hit hardest? And where are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment and let's talk about it. Your feedback shapes where this story goes next.